We're here this evening with Professor Benjamin Beit-Hallahmi, Professor Emeritus of Psychology from the University of Haifa. His specialty was psychology of religions. Professor Beit-Hallahmi was once, long time ago, practicing psychology, but he gave it up in order to teach. Good evening, Professor Beit-Hallahmi. Let me ask you, is anti-Zionism equal to anti-Semitism?
Well, if I need to judge whether a certain statement is anti-Semitic, I read it looking for statements about Jews in general. Anti-Semitism is usually expressed in the form of statements about the evil traits of Jews or the evil deeds of Jews. And this certainly comes up in many discussions of Israel and the Palestinians and events in West Asia. But the question about anti-Zionism is whether it uses anti-Semitic arguments. Does anti-Zionism reject the ideology of Zionism by saying that this is a typical expression of Judaism or Jewishness or the negative traits that Jews have displayed over generations? That's the issue for me. You have to read it carefully and see what the statements are and what the arguments are. If your argument is that this is just another evil Jewish deed because Jews are by nature evil, then I would say that it moves in the direction of anti-Semitism. The question is, how can we isolate arguments about Zionism from arguments about Jews in general? And again, this means careful reading. Do you reject the idea of Jewish sovereignty or Jewish self-determination, which I think is not really a good idea, or you reject and you criticize the way Zionism has created the state of Israel in West Asia at the expense of the Palestinians. These are two kinds of things. So I think that a clear message of anti-Zionism, untainted by anti-Semitism, would be a critique of Zionist practice, the Zionist practice of colonizing Palestine against the wishes of the indigenous population, without any reference to supposedly typical Jewish traits.
Okay, so do you agree with the IHRA example of anti-Semitism, that if somebody singles out Israel for criticism, let's say somebody says, you know what, Israel, they did a bad thing with the Palestinians, but they don't criticize North Korea or they don't criticize Syria, would you believe that that is a sign that their criticism is actually motivated by anti-Semitism?
Well, I think that we should really thank the defenders of Israel for drawing our attention to many other cases where indigenous peoples are abused or where basic human rights are violated. I think this is wonderful that they are reminding us about terrible things that are going on in China, in Africa, in Asia, wherever. That's wonderful. But it's totally irrelevant to the discussion of Israel and Palestine, because, you know, 2 wrongs or 500 wrongs don't make a right. And if we are talking about Palestine, let's talk about Palestine. And certainly we should support all those who are fighting for the rights of the oppressed all over the world.
Okay, so So you being an Israeli, if somebody were to say, you know what, I don't think Israel should have been created because the only way it could have been created was the way that it was. A binational state was on the table once upon a time, but it was rejected. So right now it's either a state that ensures a Jewish majority by whatever means it deems necessary, or they're not going to have what they refer to as a Jewish state at all. Given those two choices, you being an Israeli, the other choice would be either growing up in the place where you did or growing up in a Muslim majority state.
Yeah.
Would you say that somebody that would insist that the entire Zionist enterprise was a mistake and there should never have been and there should not be today a state that insists on being a majority Jewish state, calling it a Jewish state nation law, and etc., would that be anti-Semitic?
Well, again, more and more people today are ready to entertain the notion that indeed creating Israel in West Asia wasn't a good idea. And this has been expressed many, many times. The question is, again, whether this is anti-Semitic. It is anti-Semitic if the argument is Jews don't deserve sovereignty. Jews don't deserve self-determination. This is really an argument that singles out one group. I think that anybody, any group, can decide on living together and running their own lives. And my favorite example is always, let's say we have a bunch of lesbian nuns who are also of Irish Catholic descent and are all alcoholics, okay? So this bunch of lesbian alcoholic nuns want to live together on a farm in New Jersey. That's their perfect right, and they can run their own affairs on this farm if the cost to other people isn't prohibitive. In the case of Israel, the problem is not that Jews are running their own affairs, but that they are imposing an unbearable cost on another group, the indigenous population of Palestine. This is the issue, and I don't think that we are singling them out. I think that in any case, let's say if the same group of lesbian alcoholic Catholic nuns want to create their commune in the middle of Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, I think that there are going to be objections, despite a variety of legal defenses. Okay, this is creating too much of a cost. And I think that this principle should be applied equally to any group, whether it's the lesbian nuns or the Jews.
Okay, so give me your opinion about this. Let's take your example about the alcoholic nuns, okay? So they make their state in South Pacific Island. They bought the island, fair and square, no problem. Now they want it to be a democracy. So some other people move in, and perhaps there were some natives on that island anyway, okay? Now, suddenly what happens is the demographics change, and more people move in that are not nuns, and they're not even alcoholics. And before you know it, these nuns are going to be minority on their own island. Do you feel that they would be entitled to make laws that would ensure that their, whatever characteristics you named, they would remain a majority regardless of who wants to live there? And if they would do that, would that still be considered a democracy?
Well, I think that your question takes us back to the idea of apartheid. And actually, in the history of Zionism in Palestine, this idea came up very early, actually in the 20s and the 30s, because in the 20s and the 30s, the British suggested creating a Palestinian parliament in which the inhabitants of Palestine would be represented. And so the Zionist movement was very, very worried about this idea, because at the time when it was first suggested, there were only 150,000 Jews in Palestine versus 800,000 indigenous Palestinians. And the British idea was that, of course, the parliament should represent the population. And the Jews regarded this as a threat, a mortal threat to the Zionist project. And so one famous Zionist leader claimed that deciding on the future, the political future of Palestine, should be only in the hands of Jews. That's it. That's the principle. Now, fortunately for Zionism, this parliament was never created because of Zionist opposition. So this is exactly something that happened already in history. And similarly, in South Africa, the white minority preserved its political superiority through the creation of the apartheid system.
So you would, if I understand you right, you would agree with John Kerry, who said that you can either have a Jewish state or a democratic state, but it can't be both. Meir Kahane also said that. They both said the same thing. One just wanted a Jewish state, the other one wanted a democracy. But you agree with them that it cannot be both.
Yeah, and I think that many other people have made this observation that, of course, and it's the same holds true for a Christian democracy or a Muslim democracy or a Buddhist democracy. It's either a democracy or an ethnic domination state or a religious domination state.
The definition, the IHRA definition, was created by an organization that calls itself the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. You once mentioned to me, Benny, that you were the one that coined the now very famous phrase, Holocaust industry, the Holocaust industry. Could you tell us, Professor, what you mean by that phrase and how it is being weaponized in the fight to make anti-Zionism into anti-Semitism?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure how it's being used in terms of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because the Holocaust, the great catastrophe that befell the Jews of Europe in the 20th century, has nothing to do with our discussion. And what has happened is that there was this idea of a world without Jews. And the Nazis were trying to create a world without Jews. And this was indeed a major catastrophe for the Jews and an incredible event in terms of modern history, because this was modern history, not the Middle Ages. And there were Zionist leaders already in the 19th century who were warning the Jews about such a catastrophe. So there were Zionist leaders, Zionist authors in the 19th century who were really predicting the coming of the Holocaust.
There were Christians as well that did that in America. There were Christians as well that were warning about that, and non-Zionist Jews as well.
Yeah, but there was one man, his name was Lilienblum, a remarkable man who wrote in 1881 that the next chapter in the history of Europe is going to be titled Nationalism. And this chapter will be written in blood.
Mm-hmm.
And Jews are in danger of being exterminated by European nationalism. And so this is already in 1881. Theodor Herzl also wrote about a major catastrophe that would be coming if the Jews remain in the same situation in Europe. So this nightmare became a reality. And the interesting thing is that in terms of Jewish history, if we look at the Jewish people as one collective all over the world, and we speak in terms of the status of Jews on this planet, since 1945, Jews on this planet have experienced a period of unbelievable success and prosperity. And this is something which is quite remarkable, because this follows this greatest catastrophe in which 1/3 of the Jewish people were exterminated. And today, everybody is talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1945, nobody was talking about PTSD. The survivors of this catastrophe got up and started doing things and started settling in different places and starting making a life for themselves and achieved a remarkable success. If you look at Holocaust survivors, you see them since 1945 in every field of endeavor, in business, in science, in politics. And so this is just a remarkable piece of history. Indeed, what happened was that before the Holocaust, Zionism was a minority movement among diaspora Jews. After the Holocaust, as I said, Zionism was the only movement left standing. In Eastern Europe, there were the Jewish communists, of course, and they held significant roles in the communist regimes of Eastern Europe after 1945. So this was the other option, which also disappeared from the face of the earth. So basically, the victory of Zionism among Jews has to do certainly with these catastrophic events, the terrible events in Europe, which simply wiped out the Yiddishists, the Bundist. The Yiddish language is still kept alive by a few people, but Zionism had now a unique position. Now, it's true that it didn't happen immediately after 1945, but today, and I've said this before, most Jews in the world definitely identify with Israel and identify with the Zionist triumph, and identify very much with the idea of Jewish sovereignty. But let me turn to the question of the memory of the Holocaust and how it's being used. The memory of the Holocaust is certainly being overused in the sense that, for example, I think the best known example is the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and many other Holocaust museums all over the United States, which is really bizarre, as the Holocaust was not a part of American history. It was a part of European history. So this happened, of course, because of the immense political power of Jewish people in the United States.
Zionists.
In the first,
the Zionist power.
Especially the English-speaking world, and the fact that quite a few Holocaust survivors came to the US after 1945, and many of them have been quite successful and quite creative. So it became really an elite population. The Jews are an elite population all over the world. If you look at Argentina, or you look at France, or you look at Britain, or you look at Denmark, or you look at Australia, or you look at New Zealand, the Jews are overwhelmingly in the elite, the intellectual elite, the financial elite, etc., etc. So they were able to institutionalize a Holocaust memory. Now, this is being used, of course, by spokespeople for Israel and Zionism every day. And this is a winning argument. And it is a winning argument because when you go back to World War II and the Holocaust, there are no two sides. There is only one side. Okay? And you don't have to give equal time to the other side. We
Nazis, you mean?
What happened. And so this is used by Zionism, but I've seen this also among individual Jews, okay, who experienced the Holocaust survivors. And of course, the experience is very traumatic. And it's something that gives rise to a lot of fears, a lot of worries. And the Jewish collectivity also nourishes these worries. Now, I would recommend a book by Isaac Bashevis Singer, Enemies, a Love Story. It's a remarkable book. Isaac Bashevis Singer won the Nobel Prize. And by the way, he was a unique Nobel laureate because his first reaction when he was told that he won the prize was that he didn't deserve it. He said, I don't deserve it. My good friend Henry Miller deserves it better than me. And this shows you.
You don't see that much today.
Modest and honest to a fault. But the book is remarkable. It's about Holocaust survivors in New York City after 1945. The people who escaped, survived, and come over here. And if you want to understand what the Holocaust did to people who survived it, you should read this remarkable book. But at the same time, like I said before, the remarkable thing about the survivors is how they went back to life and they went back to creating a new life for themselves. They went back to creating families, to working productively, to creating businesses, to winning the Nobel Prize, not just in literature, but also in science, etc., etc. But still, the fear is there. And I think that you have to understand that a collectivity that experiences such a trauma will go back to this incredible feeling that this may happen tomorrow. And there is a book, again, a book by Aaron David Miller, who is an American diplomat who wrote a book about his own life. And this is a guy that worked for the US government and the CIA and was involved in many negotiations with Israel and the Palestinians, etc. He talked about the fact that when he was young, he was being told about suitcases being kept ready for a new American Holocaust. So this is, I think, quite remarkable. This is a personal story. It's not something but this is a reflection of a feeling that may be prevalent, and we can understand why, among many, many Jews whose relatives perished and they survived. In Israel also, the situation is such that people have expressed many, many times in public the idea that they don't know if Israel is going to exist 20 years from now. Okay, so this is, if you read the Israeli media, there are articles expressing doubts about the future of Israel every year. Okay, so if Israel...
What are they afraid of exactly?
They are afraid of military defeat. That's
Iran?
why everybody in the region, but also they are talking about the internal situation in terms of hope and politics and corruption, etc., etc. But it's a very common thing, and I can point you articles in the Israeli media over the past year, okay, expressing doubts about whether Jewish sovereignty is going to survive, and also people telling you, I have some very good friends who have told me that they reached the conclusion that Jews are not made for sovereignty. Okay, Jews can do okay when somebody else is running the show, when they are in France or Italy or the US or Britain.
That's anti-Semitic, isn't it?
It's not a viable kind of idea. Okay, this is just, but what I'm telling you is that there is this feeling, and I will mention another fact, which is quite remarkable, that the percentage of Israelis who have foreign passports is the highest in the world.
Well, hold, dual or just foreign, you mean? No,
foreign,
it's two.
Foreign. In addition to the Israeli passport.
Dual, two passports, okay.
Yeah, no, 2 or 3 or more. But
right.
For example,
I didn't know that.
The government of Portugal announced a couple of years ago or so that they would be ready to give Portuguese passports to the descendants of Jews expelled from Portugal 500 years ago. And you know
what happened?
Went to their lawyers, and now 2.5 million Israelis are entitled
to Portugal.
To the lawyers.
So, Benny, so how do you explain this? I mean, the truth is, I really, listen, all 90% of Ashkenaz Jews my age, their parents are Holocaust survivors. Okay? 90%. I grew up, 90% of my friends, not the Sephardim, the Ashkenaz Jews, their parents are all Holocaust survivors. So, but here's the question. 2 questions for you. What you said. First, when you say people who experience this are going to be afraid of it happening again. I grew up here in America, and I've experienced like very little anti-Semitism, the very little. And I have a granddaughter graduating high school this year, and the Holocaust to them is just as historical as George Washington, save for the fact that they are being artificially induced, an artificially induced PTSD by all of these Holocausts, and by telling them it's going to happen, Hitler's around the corner. And it's all, if you don't support Israel, Hitler's coming back to kill you tomorrow. Now, in Israel, at the same time, as you said, by the way, I'm one of these people who are also concerned whether Israel will exist in 20 years. It is the most dangerous place where Jews live anywhere else in the world. I have never ran into a bomb shelter in my life. I am not afraid of Iranian bombs. I had friends who, unfortunately, in Israel who were killed. Israel's a dangerous place, and there are other problems as well. I don't know, obviously, the one that said Jews are not cut out to, that's an anti-Semitic thing. But the question is, was it wise or smart? I mean, maybe it just wasn't a smart idea. They landed that, they rooted themselves in a place, as you said before, they're not wanted over there, right? They constantly, their prime ministers are constantly coming to America to beg for support. They need a lobby over here. I feel much safer here in the United States of America than my friends do in Israel. So, And as you said, on one hand, the Zionists said about how the diaspora Jews are so weak. On the other hand, it takes a lot of strength after a Holocaust to rebuild your lives. Sounds to me like a very strong people they were. Just different idea of what strength is. In any case, so you believe that this Holocaust industry, I mean, what is the purpose of it? Why do they do this? What do they want with it?
Let me just give you one more piece of information about foreign passports. Mm-hmm. I've seen here in New York City advertisements by lawyers offering to get you a European passport.
For Americans.
You know where I've seen those advertisements? In Jewish newspapers in New York City. Okay, so apparently Jewish people in New York City are interested in foreign passports.
Yeah, of course, because they listen to what Israel says, and Israel keeps telling them there's going to be a Holocaust. So, of course, they're interested. You see, they have propaganda, and they tell Jews, you need to be afraid. Holocaust is coming. Holocaust is coming. About a year ago, there was a synagogue in Muncie where that nut came with a machete and started chopping up people. The rabbi of that synagogue was begged by the Israeli government to come move to Israel. They wanted to show people that when anti-Semitism happens, you have to run to Israel. So he told them, you crazy, it's much safer over here. I'm sure there are Jews who are made to believe they should be afraid. The numbers, the statistics show that it is much, much safer over here than it is in Israel for Jews. And yes, they are scared, but you know why they're scared? They're scared because people are telling them, be scared. Hitler, America's not safe. Nowhere is safe. Look at the Holocaust. That justifies Zionism. Anti-Semitism will always be here. Yeah. So, of course, there are people who are interested, but that doesn't mean, listen, you know what paranoia is, right?
Yeah, but I think that, again, let's turn to the uses of the Holocaust memory. Mm-hmm. I think, again, it's used as a political argument very, very often. And it does work not only in the US, but also in Europe, because European people are still feeling guilty about their cooperation, not their own cooperation, but their grandparents. Okay, if you are a German diplomat or a French diplomat or a Dutch diplomat, your grandfather might have collaborated with the Nazis. That's a fact.
Sure.
So when the matter of the Holocaust is brought up, it's going to do something to you, and it's going to shake up your confidence. It's going to make you listen to Israeli arguments, and that's why Germany is Israel's strongest defender in Europe. And there is this so-called special relationship between Germany and Israel.
So what's your solution, Professor? What do you think we should do about this?
Well, I think that
I think they need a good psychologist. I think these people...
The way I treat it is, I say the Holocaust was indeed a catastrophe, a nightmare. But if we are talking about Zionism, let's keep the Holocaust as much as possible out of the discussion, because, and I look at the history of Zionism, the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine was created and expressed long before the Holocaust.
Yes.
I brought it up before. I mentioned in 1773, Russian Navy officers are talking to Italian Jews about a Jewish state in Palestine.
Yes, and Francis Kett, and there were Christians in the 1600s that wanted this.
Okay, so in the 1840s, the British took up the idea, and this was indeed the beginning of this. And this is before Jews in Europe start talking about Palestine.
Before Herzl was born, the Christian Zionists already
Yes.
said they wanted a Jewish state there.
Yeah. So before Lilienblum, I mentioned Lilienblum.
Yes.
Lilienblum woke up only in 1881-82 after the pogroms.
In Russia.
Because Lilienblum, like many other Jews, was a Russian nationalist. But then he realized that the Russian people were carrying out the pogroms, and some of the intellectuals were justifying them because
Yes.
it was the voice of the people.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was that we have to learn from the common people, from the poor peasants. We have to learn from them. So basically, this is long before the Holocaust. And the European idea, the Christian idea was there. And even the Zionist colonization in Palestine with a vision of a Jewish state and Jewish sovereignty started immediately afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there was a man named Dubnov,
Simon.
of the famous historian.
Mm-hmm.
And this Dubnov came to Palestine and wrote his brother about how we are going to create a Jewish state here with a Jewish army.
And Moses Hess.
So this is long before the Holocaust and before Theodor Herzl started thinking about Jewish sovereignty. There were Zionist settlements in Palestine already, okay, and the Zionist enterprise was moving quite forcefully in terms of settlement, in terms of creating institutions, creating movements, having farmers, having workers in Palestine, and then in 1917, of course, the great diplomatic victory of the Balfour Declaration, etc. This is all before the Holocaust. And the great diplomatic victories were in 1917 and in 1922 with the British Mandate, which incorporated, indeed, the Balfour Declaration. So again, this is all happening without the Holocaust. And in 1917, there were maybe 50,000 Jews in Palestine. That's all. So already with very few, and most of them were not Zionists, with a few thousand Zionist settlers in Palestine, you have a movement that has a clear vision of taking over the country. And this became a reality, okay, in the 1930s, but this is, again, has to do with Hitler. In the 1930s, there was this great migration of German-speaking Jews, and the coming of these people to Palestine with their technology and some capital created the Jewish state. But this is, of course, related to the Holocaust. Otherwise, without Hitler, the number of Jews in Palestine would have been a lot smaller in Palestine, and the institutions would have been less developed. But at the same time, I want to make it clear that the Holocaust is no justification for anything, but Jews will feel still that the Holocaust is some kind of insurance policy.
And Israel is some kind of insurance policy.
Yeah.
So the Holocaust is an insurance policy.
Yeah, and let me mention here Seinfeld. I'm not sure Seinfeld, but there was a Seinfeld episode that really made fun of the Holocaust monologue. What is the typical New York Holocaust monologue? I am a survivor. Okay, this famous phrase. You know, Jewish people who say, I am a survivor. Don't tell me anything. I know. So Jerry Seinfeld and his friends, maybe it was the idea came possibly from Larry David. And there is an episode, you must get hold of this.
I don't have a television.
So you should watch this episode because this is a direct attack on the survivorship mythology, so the survivorship monopole or whatever, or defense. And a man or somebody, I don't know who said, I'm a survivor. Don't tell me anything. I'm a survivor. And it turns out what they're referring to, of course, is not the Holocaust. They would never bring up the Holocaust, and they would not make fun of the Holocaust.
What did he survive?
But this was a survival of a terrible tragedy, a catastrophe that had to do with a ship. Andrea Doria was the last, I think, ship that ran aground on the Atlantic coast of the US, on its New York City, and with great loss of life. So this man in the monologue is a survivor of the Andrea Doria. But I'm sure that I wasn't mistaken by realizing that this is actually making fun of the Jewish I'm a survivor monologue.
Well, yeah, those people like that, you know what?
Yeah.
Look, there's no way in the world any of us can judge any of the survivors. What they went through was absolute, hell.
Yeah.
That said, it is, for political reasons, it is overdone, and it's being used, as you said. I agree with you 100,000%. It's being used for political reasons. But let me ask you something. I really like what you said here, and let me play devil's advocate for a moment, okay? I'm going to be a Zionist for a moment, and I'm going to be one of the Holocaust industry people for a moment, okay? How would you deal with the following argument, which actually is discussed whenever the IHRA definition is brought up, okay? All right, so Professor Beit-Hallahmi, what do you want to do? Israel exists, it's there. It's a problem, it shouldn't have been there. They shouldn't have a Jewish state there. It's not a democracy. So what do you suggest we do? Bottom line, you're the prime minister, you're the dictator, you're in charge of the world. Professor Beit-Hallahmi, how do we solve this problem?
Well, I can quote to you one of the wealthiest Israelis in the world. Actually, he was so wealthy that he moved to London because he didn't want to pay Israeli taxes, you see.
Okay.
But his name is Idan Ofer, and he inherited the money from his father, but he's also a good businessman himself. And when he was interviewed in Israel about the Israel-Palestine situation, his response as a businessman, as a man of wealth, was, we should first of all pay reparations, just like the Germans paid reparations to us. Okay, that's Idan Ofer.
Okay.
And somebody who's not involved in politics, but this was his immediate reaction.
Okay, then what? You're still stuck with a Jewish state that refuses to become a democracy by your definition.
Yeah. So this is one step in the right direction. And by the way, I can tell you a funny story. More than 20 years ago, I had a car stolen from me in Israel. And I'm pretty sure that this car was stolen by Palestinians, because there are Palestinians who specialize in this kind of thing. They tear it apart for the spare parts, you see? Okay. And the car disappears. So my claim is this car was worth something. When the day comes and we pay reparations to the Palestinians, and I have to pay something, and as an Israeli, I want the money that I paid for a new car to be included in my in whatever
You want a tax deduction.
invoice, whatever invoice
You want a tax deduction.
That's right. I want a deduction. Anyway, but it's clear.
So what are we going to do about Israel? I mean,
okay. So no, the problem is not about Israel. The problem is the Palestinians, who are now at the lowest point in their history, are very, very weak. And the situation that we have now is a situation where one side is very, very strong and getting stronger. The other side is getting weaker by the day and irrelevant. And, the Palestinians are trying to make noises now about we want to go back to negotiations and being nice and all that. But in Israel, you should see, in Israel, this is ignored because Israelis now have other things to worry about. There are going to be new elections and internal politics and this and that, and the Palestinians are forgotten. Okay, except every day another Palestinian is killed. Okay, that's the only attention they get. So I think that changing the course of history is something which is quite complicated and will take a lot of moves. And also consider the fact that now in the United States, everybody thinks that the new president is going to change the direction in which the ship of state is sailing. I'm not sure about this at all. I'm sure that there's going to be a new ambassador to Israel, but the settlers in the West Bank have nothing to worry about, etc., etc. So we are really talking about a desperate situation, and the Palestinians are more demoralized and more passive than ever. So if you ask me what I would do, the first thing I mentioned was the business preparations, which is, and by the way, you know what a typical Israeli reaction to that is?
No.
About paying the reparations. Oh, yeah. The Palestinians should get reparations, but not from us, from the US, from Britain, Germany, from everybody.
Yeah, sure, of course. Everything has to come from the US. Israel.
Sure. This is the Israeli reaction. That
the schnorrers.
The US should pay for it. So
of course.
Which reminds me, by the way, going back to 1967. You remember that?
Okay, I remember. I was a kid, but I remember 1967.
1967 war. After the war, there was a program, on American television about how Israel won the war. And they interviewed the Air Force commander.
Okay.
And the Air Force commander said, very simple. The formula is very simple. US money, French planes, and Israeli pilots. That's it.
But they had more pilots than planes. Yes, that's right, 100%. So so really what you're saying, if I hear you right, is that Israel today really is, they said that they wanted to become independent and they didn't want to depend on people because of anti-Semitism. They're just as dependent now. If America and France would have been anti-Semitic or anti-Israel in 1967, say goodbye, right? That's what this Air Force guy is saying.
Well, again, I think the reason they could have won, even with much less support from the US and France, was the quality of the armies.
Yes.
Okay, because this goes back for a long, long time.
Were you in the war? I just want to ask, were you in the 67 war?
No, I was, at the time, I was in the US physically.
You in the US?
Watching television, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead, you were saying the quality of the armies.
Yes.
What were you saying?
Yeah, I was saying that, the Jews pride themselves today, or Israelis pride themselves today, on the fact that they are great fighters.
Warriors, yeah.
And good soldiers, and they have a great army. And the question is whether this is something that you should be proud of. So on the other side, on the Arab side, there was one piece of military strategy that was brilliant, and this was in 1973. Mm-hmm. Other than that, most of the time, the military forces that Israel is facing are not of very high quality. And this goes back to the Palestinians in the 30s already, when there was the Great Palestinian Rebellion and the 1948 war, where the Palestinian side just fell apart completely and disintegrated, just with no. Right. It was so basically, it didn't take much, and it doesn't take much. See, my own feeling is that it doesn't take much to fight a war successfully, based on my own limited experience. But Israel has survived so well because of the immense amounts of money delivered from the West, especially the US, and we are talking about more than $300 billion.
It's a lot of money.
Since 1948.
That's a lot of money, $300 billion.
Yeah, so with this kind of money. Now, I would say one thing in praise of the Israeli leadership, that we know that there are many third world countries where a lot of money in aid is sent over and it disappears into the pockets of the local dictator and his family.
Right.
This doesn't happen in Israel. Okay, in Israel, there is a standard, a basic standard that allows for the money to be used effectively in developing the state, you see, and defending the state, you see. So this is one thing that has been good in terms of Israeli survival.
Thank you very much, Professor Benjamin Beit-Hallahmi, for the enlightening and very interesting perspective. Thank you very much.
Anytime, it's my pleasure. Thank you.